The third quadrant of the galaxy has always been a cesspool of astronomical scale. Interstellar empires clash almost constantly, while young and inexperienced civilizations struggle to maintain their independence, as they get embroiled in the cosmic tussle as soon as they take for the stars. Here, it is not uncommon for planets to be pacified by one faction after years of bitter fighting against their neighbors, only to be snatched away by a third power a few months after. It is only natural for historic rivalries to be born and fueled by these chaotic circumstances. The Galviki were a prominent but small merchant empire, whose economic might impacted on a galactic scale and was comparable only to the Yanis, with whom they were constantly at odds. They gained significant pleasure and profits by raiding and hampering each other's shipping routes, to the point where the galactic community was forced to intervene by sending warships to escort the merchantmen of both, hoping an understrength, unmotivated and underfunded flotilla of centuries-old warships would dissuade them from scattering each other's cargo bay in deep space. As everyone had predicted, besides those labeled as the best and brightest minds in the galaxy, this resolution was scarcely effective and outright embarrassing in certain cases. The number of ships involved was too few to have any real impact on either side. Reports indicate that raiding parties rarely encountered galactic escort vessels during their missions. Even when they did, it often made little difference. According to the rules of engagement, the escorts could not fire their weapons unless fired upon. This allowed the attackers ample time to aim and destroy the cargo ships before making a swift escape. It was clear to the Galviki that action was necessary, as their losses were greater than those of the Yanis, even if only by a small amount. Their elders agreed to outsource the defense and security of their merchant ships to qualified professionals, rather than relying on unmotivated and underpaid crews from the galactic community. After months of discussions, they concluded that given their conditions, it was highly preferable to hire security experts from outside their interstellar borders, as their population was rather limited and quite inexperienced in the matter of warfare. With their substantial financial resources, they were willing to overlook expenses as long as the arrangement yielded profits. Numerous war bands and mercenary groups operating in the area quickly came forward to offer their services, each with varying levels of skill and compensation. Initially, the Galviki were pleased with the outcomes, as they were able to secure safe passage for their ships while also sinking many of their rivals. However, their advantage would not last. Although they were not surprised, they found themselves unprepared when the Yanis began employing ships for hire under their own banner. And so, space battles became quite common along popular and heavily trafficked commercial routes in the third sector. Numerous pleas and attempts to de-escalate the situation came from neighboring states, merchant unions, and even the galactic community, which often faced ridicule and were dismissed from any serious discussions. As the two factions continued to increase the number of beneficiaries on their payrolls, even going so far as to hire disorganized groups of low-quality pirates, it became evident to everyone that the situation was no longer sustainable, both economically and politically. In a rare display of political firmness, the galactic community demanded that the Galviki and the Yanis cease their absurd hybrid warfare by enacting several pieces of legislation that limited the number and scope of hired mercenaries. The two merchant empires had no choice but to comply, as they could not afford the severe economic sanctions that would cripple their already dwindling treasuries. Still, something had to be done. The Galviki elders believed, rightly so, that this momentary hiatus would only lead either side to gather weapons and ammunition for the inevitable outbreak of all-out conflict. It was then that they received a message from the Yanis, inviting them to a ceremonial battle to settle the tensions, at least temporarily. The Galviki promptly agreed, knowing that even if this upcoming clash resulted in their defeat, even if hurt in their pride, they could finally shift their focus back to commercial warfare rather than actual war. A race began to scout the best mercenaries and most skilled fighters, not only from the third sector, but from across the entire galaxy. Envoys from both the Galviki and the Yanis scouted from one corner of the Milky Way to another, searching for the most renowned, fierce, and effective warbands. Often, Galviki and Yanis delegations committed several spaceport violations to land their ships first, ensuring an early opportunity to interview infamous pirate captains or reputable corporations involved in space security. Unbeknownst to everyone, the Galviki had carefully selected their fighters well in advance. Whispers and rumors from the second quadrant had reached the elders of the Galviki, prompting them to send a delegation to the planet known as Terra. There, the envoys observed and praised the effectiveness and results of the Terran warships during the Coalition-Union conflict, which was raging in the Orion Arm at that time. After receiving such compliments from the delegation, the elders needed no further persuasion to request the Terran government for mercenaries to fight for their honor, which they happily provided in the form of so-called privateers. The privateers arrived at a considerable cost, leading to arguments and discord among the Galviki high society. However, any doubts about their cost-effectiveness were swiftly cast aside, as the first warships entered a stationary orbit around the Galviki capital planet. Never before had such heavily armed and armored ships been seen in the third sector, especially in such numbers. Typically, when hiring a mercenary band, one would expect to see a dozen smaller crafts escorting a couple of larger vessels. Instead, the privateers arrived with a wide variety of ships, ranging from small corvettes to fleet carriers and dedicated logistics vessels. For the merchant-oriented Galviki, victory seemed all but assured. On the day of the decisive battle, the Galviki sailors were taken aback when the Yanis arrived with a mercenary fleet of comparable strength, both in numbers and quality. Upon closer inspection, it appeared that of every Galviki vessel, the Yanis had a ship of similar size and purpose. Nevertheless, a battle seemed unavoidable, as the two fleets moved into position, carefully forming their battle lines. The flagships from each mercenary side approached one another. Neither the Galviki nor the Yanis understood what was happening, but they observed with indifference, thinking that their hired ships were performing some sort of unknown tradition. The ships came to rest side by side in the void between the two formations, connected by a boarding umbilical tube. Minutes passed with both sides staring across the vastness of space. Then, all of a sudden, the two ships in the middle departed, slowly navigating back to their respective formations. Before the Galviki could ask what had occurred, both mercenary fleets broke ranks, using their side thrusters to turn the ship's bows in the same direction. Job done. We are going home, the human commander announced over the intercom to the Galviki officers. Understandably, they protested, stating they had paid a substantial amount of credits for their services and expected the privateers to engage the opposing formation. The human commander smiled broadly before replying, "What do you mean? We removed a significant enemy formation from the battlefield, suffering no losses, I might add. As per the contract, we are eligible for extra pay since we have preserved the integrity of all your accompanying ships. The Galviki, at the time, had no idea the Yanis were having a rather similar conversation with the commander of the mercenaries they hired, which was described by a Yanis officer as cheerful in dangerous ways. However, both sides ultimately had to let the mercenaries go, as they lacked the means to oppose such powerful fleets. Resigned to their circumstances, the two rival empires decided to set aside their swords and return to commerce, realizing that pursuing trade would be better for everyone involved. To add insult to injury, both the Galviki and Yanis embassies received letters expressing sincerest gratitude for their excellent hiring decisions. They stated that future requests of a similar nature would be addressed promptly and professionally, aiming for a deal acceptable to all parties. It may not be surprising that these letters originated from the same galactic shipping address.